in a narrow hollow in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina, in the autumn of 1851. 31 children from a single one-room schoolhouse walked through a gap in the ridge on a clear Tuesday morning, and in that condition were never seen again. 4 stumbled out of the woods 6 days later, barefoot, silent, their hair at the temples turned white. In some official form or another, the other 27 have remained missing for 175 years. What the county ledger recorded as an accident of weather, what the church recorded as a visitation of providence, and what the 4 survivors refused to speak of until the last of them died in a state sanitarium in 1928, adds up to a story the county itself tried 3 separate times to bury. In 1889, the marker that once stood at the mouth of that hollow was removed. In 1902, the schoolhouse was burned. The land was sold and resold until no living person in the valley could point to where the children had gone. Before we continue with the story of Ashcom Hollow, take a moment to subscribe to this channel C Music and turn on the notification bell. And in the comments, tell us from which state or country you are listening tonight, because what you are about to hear was written down in a diary that a granddaughter handed to a historian in 1971, and allowed before. What that diary contained has never been read. To understand what happened on the morning of October the 21st, 1851, the place you first have to understand. In a fold of the Blue Ridge, the settlement of Ashcom lay about 30 miles west of the nearest proper town, which at that time was Morganton. In any sense that would be recognized today, it was not a town. A loose scatter of perhaps 40 farmhouses, it was a single Presbyterian meeting hall that on weekdays doubled as the schoolhouse, a blacksmith, a grist mill on Pigeon Creek, and a general store run by a widow named Prudence Halsey. Of Scots, Irish and German descent, the people who lived there were, most of them second or third generation from families who had come down the Great Wagon Road from Pennsylvania in the 1780s. In the bottoms they farmed tobacco and corn, in the woods kept hogs, and a thin whiskey they distilled that the revenue men had not yet found a reason to climb the ridges for. Hard the winters were, the drifts in the high passes sometimes closing the road to Morganton for weeks at a stretch. Green and closed the summers were, the air so thick with moisture that the laundry hung on the line at dawn at dusk would still be damp. By every account left to us, the people were pious, wary of outsiders and keepers of long memories. Insults they did not forget, debts they did not forget, and they did not forget, though not often they spoke of it, the things that the older ones had been told by the older ones before them about the ground that lay above the creek. The hollow itself, the one the children walked into, sat perhaps a mile and a quarter east of the meeting hall, up a path that ran along the north bank of Pigeon Creek, and then between 2 ridges cut south. On the one surviving county survey map from 1847, Ashcom Hollow it was called, after the first family that had settled the valley. By 1851, by the older name it was more commonly called, which the original settlers had taken from a Cherokee word they had imperfectly learned, and which meant, as best as anyone could translate it, the place where the ground remembers. Out of that region in 1838, during the removal the Cherokee themselves, music had been driven, and into the settlers as fragments of warning, what remained of their knowledge of the land had passed. Up that hollow after dark children were not supposed to go. In the late autumn hunters avoided it. To gather galax or moss women did not go there, though in abundance the shaded coves along the creek produced both. A man named Josiah Veach, who had settled the farm nearest the hollow's mouth in 1821 to a beech tree at the path's entrance in 1829, had nailed a wooden cross, and had told his neighbors it was to mark the boundary of a certain kind of land, though what kind he would never say. When pressed, which was rare. Only this he would say, that a man who had sold him the South 40 in 1824, an older German named Hagenbeck, who had been in the valley since 1798, on the day of the sale had pointed to the beech tree and said, "She music," in the halting English of his old age. At dusk you do not cross this mark, and across it alone you do not send a child. Not for any reason, not for any price. In the winter of 1827, without further explanation, Hagenbeck had died. For 2 years Veitch had waited before putting up the cross. And on a night he had put it up, he said, when for the 3rd time in a fortnight the wind from the hollow had woken him. And in his own bed he could not bear to lie and listen to it any longer. The schoolteacher in Ashcom that year was a young woman named Evangeline Truitt. 24 years old she was. The daughter of a Methodist circuit rider from Salisbury, and to the settlement in the spring of 1850 she had come a music under a 1-year contract that in the spring of 1851, for a 2nd year, had been renewed at a salary of $90 per annum, paid half in coin and half in the produce of the valley. Thin, fair she was, and by the descriptions left in 2 separate letters, written by her contemporaries, of a quiet authority that surprised the older men of the settlement, she was possessed. Like her predecessor to the fathers of her older pupils, she did not defer. Like the itinerant preachers who passed through, she did not soften her speech for the benefit of the deacons. An educated woman in the way that makes a mountain man nervous she was. One of the Ravenel men wrote to his brother in Charlotte, which is to say things he did not she knew, and otherwise she did not pretend. With the Halsey widow in the small upper room, above the store she boarded. By correspondence she was engaged music to a young seminarian named Cornelius Bream, who at Princeton Theological Seminary in New Jersey was studying, and a small leather diary she kept, which in most evenings by the light of a tallow candle in the room above the store she filled. This diary it is, preserved by accident in the bottom of a trunk, passed down 3 generations, and to a graduate student at Chapel Hill, in 1971 finally surrendered, that the central document forms of what we know about what happened. In the census she had taken in September of 1851, the children she taught numbered 33. From 6 to 14 they ranged in age. A boy named Absalom Ravenel, the oldest, was the son of a tenant farmer, a tall, quiet, 14-year-old who was said to read the King James Bible aloud to his younger sisters in the evenings, with a steadiness of voice that astonished visitors. A girl named Comfort, Pettigrew the youngest was, who in August had turned only 6, and who had come to the school, according to Miss Truitt's diary, clutching a small rag doll she had named Susanna, and which, during her lessons, she would not put down even until the older girls persuaded her that Susanna was tired, and in her lap wanted to sleep. Among the others 2 sets of twins were the Eakin girls Mercy and Prudence, aged 11, and the Stroop boys, Cullen and Cassius, aged 9, and a pair of cousins called the Trask boys, Phineas, who was 8, and Elihu, who was 10. A girl named Verity Pellegrin there was, who stammered, and whom after the school day ended Miss Truitt had been teaching to read separately. A boy named Thaddeus Orr there was, who was 9, and who had, his mother recorded later, a fear of water so severe that across the creek to reach the schoolhouse on wet mornings he would not wade, but would instead she music by the footbridge take the long road around. A girl named Patience Thibodeau there was, who was the daughter of a cobbler, and who in September at the county fair for her stitching had won a ribbon. On the morning of the 21st, absent 2 children were. Home with a fever. Cullen Stroop was, by her mother to help with the last of the apple-pressing patients. Thibodeau had been kept back. That 31 children in the meeting hall left when at 7:00 Miss Truitt rang the small brass bell, and the day's lessons began. Hers was the decision to take them into the hollow. And 3 days earlier, on the 18th, in her diary, she recorded the reason for it. A traveling naturalist, a man named Dr. Emmerich Kohl, a Bavarian by birth, and for the past 12 years a professor of botany at a small college in Ohio. Through the settlement on the 15th had passed, and for 2 nights on his way back east, with the Halsey widow, had lodged. At supper about a rare plant he had spoken, a species of orchid which by a name he could not pronounce the old Cherokee had called, which in late October in shaded coves in the Blue Ridge bloomed, and which in the vicinity of Ashcom he believed, on the basis of certain specimens, say music, he had collected in the Smokies the previous year, could be found. From his portfolio a small pressed specimen he had shown Miss Truitt. The most curious flower she had ever seen it was, she wrote, greenish, white and veined with a dark purple that in candlelight looked black, with petals that had an almost lipped quality. As though to speak the plant had been designed, she wrote. Enchanted her diary records she had been. That a walk with the children to gather the hay music, last of the autumn leaves, and perhaps to find the orchid as a natural philosophy, lesson worth more than a week of reading from the primer, would serve, she had decided. Because it was the nearest cove, with the deep shade and wet ground that Dr. Kohl had described, she chose the hollow. So far as the diary records in the entries up to the 18th about the cross on the beech tree, she did not know. About the old music, Cherokee name she did not know. About Hagenbeck or about Josiah Vache's sleepless nights, she did not know. If anyone in the settlement of her plan knew and could have warned her, no one did. The Halsey widow, 4 months later interviewed by the schoolteacher's fiancé, said as far as the beech tree, at the mouth of the hollow, she had assumed Miss Truitt intended to take the children only, where just as likely to grow the orchids were, she thought. Her music, when she realized, she said, that further into the clearing, where the spring came up, the girl had meant to go. Already dusk on the 21st it was, and by then to music be done there was nothing. Clear and cold the weather that morning was. The sort of late October morning in the southern Appalachians, when in the low places the first hard frost has fallen, and at their highest color the leaves on the maples and the hickories are. In the shadows frost there was, but out the sun was, a thin yellow sun that without much warmth gave light. Wildly happy the children, when after the morning prayer, Miss Truitt announced the walk, were said by the survivors who lived long enough to be interviewed to have been. On the path to run ahead they were given leave. Within earshot to stay they were told. Small cloth bundles with their midday bread, and apples tied at the corners and over their shoulders, slung with twine they carried. At the rear Miss Truitt walked with the 2 oldest girls, Mercy Eakin and a 13-year-old named Constance Halliard. Along the creek the path ran, on a footlog crossed it once, and into the hollow at about 800 of the clock turned south. By 900, Josiah Veach's cornfield they had passed, where the last of the ears Veach himself was pulling, and who to Miss Truitt, as she passed, raised his hand, and who later did not, he said. At the time think to ask her how far she meant to go. By 9:15, the beech tree with the cross they had passed. And for 6 days here the diary, by Miss Truitt herself kept, goes silent. In the settlement until nearly dusk the alarm was not raised. Widow Halsey, expecting her boarder back for the afternoon recitations at 2 of the clock, at first had assumed that long the naturalist walk had run, and that at the spring Miss Truitt had perhaps decided to let the children eat their bread, and of the hour had lost track. By 3, uneasy she was. To the meeting hall she walked, and empty found it. To the edge of the settlement she walked, and up the path toward the hollow looked, and nothing saw. By 4, a boy to fetch Josiah Veitch she had sent. Veitch, in his field pulling corn, set up the path that morning he had seen the children go, but back he had not seen them come. Onto his mule he climbed, and up the hollow himself rode, calling. In the flat way that coves sometimes do his voice the hollow returned, which is to say, not as an echo, but as a muffling, and no voice answered. As far as the clearing at the spring he rode, and only the small cloth bundles folded on the flat rock, and the cores of several apples on the moss scattered he saw. He said later, and he did not stay. A grown man and a Presbyterian he was, a music, and to fancies not given, he would say when pressed. But in that clearing a feeling there was, he said, like in the dark standing too close to the edge of a cliff. And his mule he turned, and at a pace that was faster than he meant rode out, and back he did not look. By full dark, 15 men with lanterns there were, and 2 hounds working the paths. By midnight 40 there were. By the morning of the 22nd, into the woods the entire settlement had emptied itself, and to Morganton to fetch the sheriff riders had gone. In the meeting hall women stayed and prayed. For 6 days the blacksmith, a man named Wilkin Mulder, his forge did not fire. Turning the gristmill stopped. Only for flour and salt the general store opened. The Reverend Obadiah Ashcom, who was 63 years old and with a cane walked. With the rest up the hollow walked, and on a log at the edge of the clearing for the whole of the 22nd, and the 23rd sat, and to anyone did not speak. In his letter to his bishop later he wrote, that there he had sat because at first he had believed, that if without ceasing he prayed, to him a sign would be given as to where the children had gone. That no sign was given he wrote, that in the late afternoon of the 23rd, what he took to be a child laughing somewhere to the east up the slope he had heard he wrote, and that he had risen and called out, and that the laughing had stopped, and that no child had appeared, and that down again he had sat, and for the first time since his wife's death in 1839, had wept. What the search parties found, or rather what they did not find, in 3 separate accounts was recorded. By Sheriff Cassian Verlander on the 27th of October a report was filed. By the Reverend Ashcom, grandson of the first settler, to his bishop in Raleigh on the 29th a letter was written. And by the school teacher's fiance, Cornelius Bream, who from Princeton when the news reached him traveled, and in the settlement for nearly 4 months stayed attempting to understand. A longer manuscript was written years later. On the following all 3 accounts agree. Perhaps 3:4 of he music, a mile up the hollow the children had gone. In a small clearing, perhaps a half-acre in size, they had stopped, where through mossy stones a spring came up. That they had stopped there signs there were. Apple cores, cloth bundles on a flat rock left folded, their corners neatly tied, as if shortly their owners had intended to retrieve them. A small pair of pattens set neatly side by side, as if to rest their owner had sat down and slipped them off. A ribbon, pale blue, of the sort that was commonly used to tie a girl's hair. A slate pencil unbroken. From that clearing further signs no were found. Out no trail led. The ground, though in places damp, away no prints leading showed. The clearing the hounds would not enter. 2 of the dogs. With some embarrassment the sheriff's report notes, at the edge of it lay down and forward, would not be coaxed. And one of them whined and the man, who tried to drag it across the line of the spring bit. For 11 days the search continued. In pairs and in threes men walked the ridges. With sticks they beat the laurel thickets. At intervals they fired muskets to signal each other. For 2 miles in both directions they walked the creek. A bent hickory branch that might, or might not by a passing child, have been broken they found, in a cleft of rock about 400 yd east of the clearing what one of the searchers, a man named Ephraim cursed, as a neat pile of small stones, 11 stones. stacked as a child might stack them, described they found, which there had not been when in early September the settlement's last hunt had passed through that cleft. With his hands cursed, who in the walk had lost a daughter of 10, the stack dismantled. What to the rest of the party he did not tell, and what from him on his deathbed in 1878 his wife only learned, was that beneath the stack a single braid of brown hair tied with a piece of red wool he had found, and that his daughter's the braid was, and that home he had taken it, and in the fire on that same night burned it, because to let the others know he could not bear, he told his wife. For a moment let this sink in. 31 children and a grown woman into a half-acre clearing 3/4 of a mile from a settlement of 40 families had walked, and being there they had simply stopped. No blood, no clothing, no disturbance of the ground. As it always had, the spring flowed. Where they had fallen the leaves lay. If as unsettling as I am you are finding this story, take a second to let us know in the comments where from tonight you are listening. And if new here you are, subscribe so the second half of this you do not miss. Because on the 6th day, what happened is what for the next 50 years the settlement spent trying to forget. In the particular way that isolated mountain communities grieved, the settlement grieved. In the streets no weeping there was. No bells rung there were. The food the women cooked, and to the houses of the families who had lost children carried, and on the porches the men sat and did not speak. On the evening of the 24th a prayer meeting was held, at which from the Book of Lamentations the Reverend Ashcom read, and the families of the missing children did not attend. Not one. The Ravenels did not come. The Pettigrews did not come. The Eakins did not come. The Trasks did not come. By a woman named Mehitable Cross, who 2 farms over from the Ravenels lived, it was said that on her front step all day on the 25th Thomasina Ravenel sat and would not go in, and would not eat, and would not speak except once to say, when her husband tried to take her inside, that because a mother knew when a child was coming she was waiting, and coming a child was. By the 26th, to a few men in pairs walking the ridges the search had been scaled back. By the 27th, effectively it had ended. To Morganton Sheriff Verlander rode back. A place where no one looked each other in the eye the settlement was. The Reverend wrote in his letter, because to meet another's eye was there, to see the same empty place that, in oneself one carried. On the morning of the 27th, at about 6:15, a woman named Sibby Larkin, who from the creek was hauling water, on the far bank saw movement. So heavy that morning the fog was, she said later. So heavy that, until she was almost in the water, she could not see the other side of the creek. Down her buckets she set and closer walked. In the shallows 4 children were standing, in water up to their knees, upstream facing. When she called to them they did not move. And she waited. Cold enough the creek that through her boots she could feel it, and by the arm took the nearest, and it was a boy named Thaddeus Orr, who 9 years music old was, and at her he did not look. White at the temples his hair, which had been brown, was. The other 3, a girl of 11 named Mercy Aiken, were, a boy of 8 named Phineas Trask, and the oldest, Absalom Ravenel, who 14 was, and who missing 2 of his front teeth was, which in his mouth on the morning of the 21st had been. Music, up to the settlement Sibby Larkin, carried and led them, and in any of them no resistance there was, she said later. Neither cold nor warm they were. Music they did not shiver, they did not cry. Bare their feet were, and from the stones of the creek, bed no cuts they showed. The clothes they had gone up the hollow in 6 days, before their clothes were, and clean the clothes, were as though they had been laundered and pressed and put back on. This last detail it was, Sibby Larkin said later, that until her own death in 1894 she would remember. Clean the clothes were. After 6 days missing in the woods, clean the clothes were. In 4 different houses under the care of their own families, the 4 were separated and placed where to take them their families had survived. Both of Absalom's parents the Ravenels had. Phineas's mother the Trasks had, his father of dysentery hemusic, in 1847 having died. With her parents and her 4 surviving siblings, Mercy Aiken was placed, though among the returned her twin Prudence was not. With his father Thaddeus Orr was placed, his mother by childbed fever in 1845 having been carried off. Hemusic for doctors was sent. In Morganton the nearest doctor was, and until the 29th did not arrive. In the intervening 2 days the children did not speak. When in front of them food was put, slowly without apparent appetite they ate. When to bed they were led they slept. Where they were walked they would walk. To their own names they did not respond. To the names of their siblings or parents they did not respond. When Thomasina Ravenel with Absalom sat and his hand held and wept and asked him repeatedly where the others had gone. At the wall young Absalom looked and did not answer. And when at last, at the end of a long afternoon, toward her he turned his head, immediately she said later that she had wished he had not, because his eyes were not his eyes, and out of them whatever was looking was not her son. And in that moment she had known, she said, that no matter how long on the step she waited her son was not coming back. When the doctor arrived, a man named Percival Cleve, who at the University of Pennsylvania had trained and who for this call specifically had been chosen, because in the eastern counties for unusual cases, he had a reputation. One by one he examined them. His notes, which in the archives of the North Carolina Medical Society survive, because, for a paper he never finished and never published, he thought the case important enough to write up. In perfect physical health 4 children describe. No bruises, no wounds, no sign of exposure or starvation. With what their family said, they had weighed at the start of the month, their weight was consistent. The clothes they had worn on the morning of the 21st, their clothes, were unchanged, not even soiled. At the temples their hair in a band about an inch wide on each side had gone white, as if painted on. Light but not faces their eyes, he wrote, tracked. Slow their pulses were, in Absalom Ravenel's case remarkably slow, 52 beats per minute, which in a boy of 14 abnormal he considered. At a bright lamp, held near their faces, they did not blink. To the sudden discharge of a pistol by his assistant in the next room, fired, they did not respond. A test he had arranged without telling the families. A test afterward he regretted. In any clinical sense he recognized catatonic they were not. Somewhere else they were. In his notes that was the phrase he used. Somewhere else they were. And whatever had taken them there in each of their bodies had sent back something that did not entirely know how to be a child. Over the following weeks, in varying degrees 3 of the 4 began to return. First was the little boy, Phineas Trask, who was 8. On the 11th of November, 21 days after his return, to his mother he began to respond. Beside his bed she was sitting. His mother wrote in a letter to her sister in Rowan County, and a hymn she had sung to him. When he was an infant she was singing, the one about the Lord being her shepherd. And his head he turned and, quite clearly, he said, "Mama." And then to cry he began. And for 3 hours he cried. His mother wrote, and him she held, and also she cried. And when done crying he slept. And when the next morning he woke, again her he knew, and his own name he knew, and the day of the week he knew, which him she had told. But what month it was he did not know, and why his father was not there he did not know. And that at all up the hollow he had ever gone, he did not know. His mother wrote. To believe he seemed, her music when from his questions she pieced it together, that still the summer it was. That ill he had been he seemed to believe. By December, in short sentences he was speaking. By spring, a dame school in Morganton he was attending, to which his parents' hay music had moved, for again in February to a carpenter, named Lemuel Quince his mother had married, who to take the boy on had agreed. And by outward measure a normal child he was, though in a room without a lamp he would not sleep, and apples he would not eat, and under any persuasion east of the house in which he lived he would not walk, because east, his stepfather noticed, was the direction in which the mountains lay. More slowly Mercy Eakin came back. In March she began to speak. Withdrawn she was, her family said, and for long minutes at the window she would stand, up the valley looking. And of asking a habit she had, at odd moments, whether the singing had stopped. What she meant by the singing no one in the house knew, and she would not explain. And when in April her mother pressed her, and directly asked her, whether of the hymns the family sang at evening prayer, she was speaking. Once Mercy shook her head and said, "No, the other singing, the one that keeps on." And then for the rest of that day she would not speak. Of the return she was the only one who, however obliquely, of what had been in the hollow spoke. Her mother, who a daybook kept, over the following 3 years, 7 separate instances recorded in which to something she called the singing Mercy referred. In each case, the definite article Mercy used, as though between them the singing were a known thing, which her mother said was what most unnerved her. On the child's part the assumption that also her mother knew. A farmer named Cyrus Palmore Mercy married in 1859 and 4 children bore, and to the age of 71 lived. Of the incident to no one else, not even her husband, she spoke, until the last week of her life, when only one thing she said, which in the family Bible her daughter Patience recorded, which was, "With the others we could not keep up, and without us they went on, and the ones who fell behind we were, and whether that was a kindness or a curse I do not know." In pieces Thaddeus or came back. In May he spoke, a word at a time, mostly words for objects in the room he saw. By June sentences he was constructing. In August, without warning, speaking he stopped, and until the following spring did not speak again. When he resumed, at first a normal 11-year-old he seemed. School he attended. In the fields his father he helped. In the summer of 1853, with CE music, another boy on the road outside the store laughing he was seen. But in the autumn of that year, on the anniversary of the walk, into a long silence that through the winter lasted he went. And the shape of his life thereafter this pattern became. His father wrote. In the autumn he did not speak, and it seemed he did not hear what to him was said. In the springs and summers, nearly as before he had been he was. 2 boys he was. His mother wrote in a letter to her sister, sent that first fall after his partial recovery, the one who up the hollow had gone, and the one who back had come, and entirely hers neither of them was. He never married. On his father's farm as a field hand, he worked until his father's death in 1868, to a state asylum in 1871. At the age of 29, he was committed after an incident in which, in an autumn silence 10 miles east from his farm, toward the old settlement of Ashcom he had walked, which by then mostly abandoned had been, and at the mouth of the hollow sitting with his hands on the beech tree, that once the cross had held, and which by then had fallen, he had been found. At the asylum in 1889 he died. Absalom Ravenel, the oldest at all, never came back. He did not speak. To his name he did not respond. In the opinion of Dr. Cleve, or the 3 other doctors who over the next 12 years examined him from any identifiable disease, he did not suffer. Good his appetite was, regular his sleep was, stable his vital signs were, simply he did not engage. In an upper room of his parents' house for the rest of their lives he lived. And as though he were an infant his mother, Thomasina, for him cared. Dressing him, bathing him, from the Bible in the evenings to him reading, though that he heard the words, no sign he gave. To look at him his father could not bear, and in the kitchen his meals ate, and on a cot in the barn from 1854 onward slept. When within a month of each other in the influenza outbreak of 1863 they both died, by his uncle Barak Ravenel he was taken in, and when in 1871 Barak died, to the state sanitarium at Morganton he was committed. For 57 more years there he lived. As the silent man to the staff he was known. What in front of him was put he ate. When he was walked in the yard he walked. He did not speak. He did not write, though over the decades a succession of doctors to hold a pencil tried to teach him. He did not draw. By any sign the staff could detect that any person in the world beside himself existed, he did not acknowledge. A mirror when one in front of him was held he did not appear to see. At loud sounds he did not startle. The only thing to do he was known, which over 57 years in the ward journals was recorded, was this: on the 21st of October of each year, between the hours of 300 and 500 in the afternoon, at the window of his room he would stand, whichever window that year he had been given, and east he would face. For precisely 2 hours he would stand. At 500, on his bed he would turn and sit, and his usual silence he would resume. Every year from 1871 to 1927 this he did. On the 3rd of February 1928 at the age of 91 he died. At the time of his death the oldest living patient in the sanitarium he was. The day nurse who with him was a woman named Imogene Darnell, in the ward journal wrote that at 6 minutes past 300 in the afternoon, his eyes the silent man opened, which since morning had been closed, and in a perfectly clear voice 3 words said, "They are coming," he said. Then his eyes he closed and died. What in the clearing had happened? That for a generation this questioned consumed the settlement understand. The school teacher's fiance, Cornelius Bream, it consumed, who every adult in the settlement during the winter of 1851 and 1852 interviewed, and who of some 400 pages a manuscript left behind, unpublished, now in the rare books collection at the University of North Carolina. The Reverend Ashcom it consumed, who on the anniversary of the disappearance until his death in 1868, an annual sermon preached, each year pressing his congregation for the sin that had, he music believed, down the judgment drawn to examine themselves, though what the sin had been he never could name. Dr. Cleavitt consumed, who to the settlement 3 times over the following 20 years returned to examine Thaddeus Orr and Absalom Ravenel, and who in 1881, with a drawer full of notes he had never been able to organize into a paper, died. Josiah Vachet consumed, who slowly over the course of the 1850s went mad, and who in his barn in the spring of 1861 hanging was found, with to his music shirt a note pinned that only read, "I should have cut down the tree. In 1830 I should have cut it down. Forgive me," and in quieter ways every historian and folklorist who since has come across the case it has consumed. The Diary of Evangeline Truitt, when in 1971 it surfaced, by the graduate student who received it to be the final answer, was believed. It was not. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the record in Ashcom deepens. If chills this story is giving you, with a friend who loves forgotten American history, share this video. The like button hit to help us grow, and subscribe so the parts of this that almost never left the archives you do not miss. Because what the graduate student found, and what he would not publish, and what eventually he burned, only one surviving copy has, and in a box in a retired professor's garage in Durham that copy sat until 2019, when at an estate sale his daughter the contents of the garage sold, and for $12 a local historian the Shin Music box bought. Here is what in the diary was. In it every night from the 17th of March 1850, when in the settlement she arrived, until the night of the 20th of October, 1851, Evangeline Truitt had written, "What one would expect from a young woman in her first post the early entries are observations about her pupils and small loneliness, to Cornelius letters written and not yet answered, descriptions of the weather. On the sermons at the meeting hall on Sundays she had heard reflections. In the summer of 1851, her walks the entries begin to record. For the exercise on Saturday afternoons to walking alone she had taken, it seems, and to clear her head of the week's noise she wrote. Along the creek the path she walked. To the north the ridge she walked. Beginning in August up the hollow she walked. The first entry in which the hollow she mentions is dated the 9th of August. That as far as the beech tree with the cross she had gone only she writes. That about the cross curious she had been, and that about it on her return the housey widow she had asked, and that an old market was she had been told, and that there Vach had put it, and that forgotten its meaning had been, with the mild condescension of a young educated woman for a rural superstition. Miss Truitt notes that to ward off some fancy of the older generation, the cross was meant, she supposes, and that a pity it is the settlement cannot see its way to clearing out such reminders of a less enlightened time. On the 16th of August, past the beech tree up to the clearing, at the spring her first walk she records. That a beautiful place it is she writes. That through the high leaves and columns the light comes down. That so cold the spring water is it aches the teeth, and that for nearly an hour on the flat rock beside it she sat. That as she sat a sound she heard she writes, which at first for the wind she took, but which, when more carefully she listened, into something like voices itself resolved, as though at a considerable distance a group of people were speaking, just below the threshold of comprehension. That frightened she was not, she writes. That somewhere beyond the ridge farmers were working, she assumed, she writes. That as a sounding chamber the cove was acting, and that on the air their talk carried she was picking up. That in good spirits home she walked, and soundly slept, she writes. On the 23rd of August, she returns. Again the sound is there. That her earlier explanation she is beginning to doubt, she writes now. Of conversation the rhythm the sound does not have. Of singing the rhythm it has, she writes, though no tune she can place. It rises and falls. What she takes to be words there are, though quite out she cannot make them. Longer this time she stays, perhaps 2 hours. That when the clearing she leaves a strong desire to stay she feels, she writes, and that for several hundred yards down the path, that she has forgotten something important, and back ought to go she has the sensation. Through September the entries further walks record, increasing in frequency. By the middle of September, 3 times a week after school, before the light fails, up the hollow she is going. Less about it than one might expect, she writes. The music of the cove she begins to describe the sound as, and later as the singing, and by the end of the month simply as it, with the familiarity of a private language. On the 29th of September, she writes that a natural phenomenon of some kind, the sound, she believes to be, perhaps related to the flow of water through rock, but that a man of science about it she would like to consult. That Dr. Cole in the settlement 2 weeks later will appear she does not yet know. There's no turning back. On the 6th of October, with her the first 2 children she takes. What the graduate student noticed this is, and what the school teacher's fiance, who never the later pages of the diary saw, never knew. If we hope to see the spring before the children she had taken. On the 6th of October, Absalom Ravenel and Mercy Eakin she took, the 2 oldest in her school. And them she took, she wrote, because to know whether to others the singing, as now she permanently called it, was audible she wanted. That imagining it she had begun to fear, she wrote. That scientifically to test the matter she wished she wrote. Up the hollow on a Saturday afternoon the two children she took. To the clearing led them, and on the flat rock to sit ask them and her tell what they heard. It they heard. Both of them heard it. Mercy, she wrote, at first was unsettled, and if they could leave asked. But fascinated Absalom was. On the rock for a full hour Absalom sat and listened. And when at last back down the path they began to walk, in a voice Miss Truitt described as dreamy he asked, whether again they might come. She agreed. On the 13th again they came. 4 children this time Miss Truitt brought, Absalom and Mercy and 2 others, a boy named Gideon Pettigrew, who was 10, and a girl named Verity Pellegrin, who was 12, and who stammered. That immediately Gideon heard the singing and laughed, she writes, and that also Verity heard it and did not laugh. A question Verity asked, she writes, which Miss Truitt had not expected. Whether inside the rock the singers were, Verity asked. How to answer not knowing, Miss Truitt said only an echo the sound was, that a natural explanation it had, and that to fear there was nothing. Verity, who normally stammered, without any stammer at all in the clearing that day spoke, Miss Truitt wrote, and her second question asked, which was, if inside the rock they are not, then where are they? Miss Truitt her answer does not record. Only that another quarter of an hour they stayed she records, and that by the hand she had to take Verity and outlead her, and that to Verity she had to promise that back they would come, because otherwise Verity would not move. On the 20th, the night before the walk, the entry she writes that 37 years later the graduate student would recognize as the center of the whole mystery. Exactly as it was written I will read it now, without editing, so that, as she wrote it at 11:30 on the night before the last morning of her life, you may hear it. 3 times in the clearing at the spring I have been, and 3 times the singing I have heard, and whether it is the singing of children or of something that to sound like children has learned I cannot tell. Dr. Cole on the evening of the 16th asked me whether in the hollow on my walks anything unusual I had heard. And when yes I said, surprised he did not seem. There were places on the ridge, he said, where in a formation he called resonant the rock lay, and where the wind and the water and the cavities beneath at certain hours and in certain seasons produced a sound, which, for voices uneducated persons mistook. These places the old Cherokee had known, he said, and had marked them, and that about them their traditions were no more than the natural tendency of the human mind to personify what it cannot explain. No harm in them there was, he said, provided at dusk one did not go. The ear is less reliable, and the imagination more. Whether he had ever been such a place I asked him, and he had not, he said. That a man of science he was, and that about them he preferred to read. Into the hollow twice before on Saturday afternoons, I had already taken children him I did not tell, because what I had heard I wished them to hear. That on the second Saturday to me, Absalom Ravenel had said after in the clearing, perhaps a quarter of an hour, we had been that in the singing words there were, and that the words were the children asking to come closer, and only the children. That to me the voice would not speak, because too lone I was, I did not tell. That without her usual stammer little Verity Pellegrin had said that behind the spring, and not above it the voices were, and that beneath the stones they were, and that lonely they were, she said, him I did not tell. That when that afternoon we left to leave 2 of the younger children had not wanted, and that out I had had to carry Gideon Pettigrew him, I did not tell. Any of this Dr. Cole I did not tell, because unashamed to admit that up the hollow without the permission of their parents, I had taken children I confess, and that to confess it would invite reproach I was aware. tomorrow all of them together, as a school outing sanctioned by the committee, I have decided, so that, as a class we may hear it, and what it is discuss. For that correct, Doctor. Music, Cole is, and that a natural cause the sound has, and that in the light of understanding the children's fancies about it will dissolve, I am convinced. That the right course this is, I am certain. At 11:30 this I am writing, and to sleep I will try. In the eaves tonight a wind there is, and for a moment again the singing I thought I heard. Though 1.25 miles from the hollow we are, which of course impossible is. The final entry, that is. Though with blank pages for the remainder of the book, the diary continues. As has been said, again Miss Truitt was never seen. Her body was never recovered. In his long manuscript her fiancé, Cornelius Bream, records that exactly as on the morning of the 21st she had left it, her boarding room was left. That made her bed was. That on the washstand her hairbrush and her small mirror were. And that open on the table beside the candle the diary lay. Not to the entry for the 20th open, but to the entry for the 16th of August, the day of to the spring her first walk. Why to that page the diary was open he does not explain. Why to nothing the candle had been allowed to burn down, he does not explain. When always to snuff it before leaving the room in the morning, Miss Truitt's habit, which the Halsey widow confirmed, was. After his return east in March of 1852, the diary itself to the Halsey widow was sent, who in the bottom of the trunk in which her winter quilts she stored kept it. On her death in 1868, to her niece she gave it, who to her daughter gave it, who in 1971, after out her mother's house cleaning, to a graduate student at Chapel Hill named Hollister Vance gave it, who at that time antebellum education in the Southern Appalachians was researching, and who to the daughter had written asking whether from her great-aunt's school the family any documents possessed. What when he read the diary Hollister Vance understood, and what by traveling to the site himself in the spring of 1972, with a geologist colleague from the university, he confirmed was the following. In that hollow there is, in the clearing where the spring comes up, beneath the surface a formation of limestone, which a series of narrow fissures contains. When from the north the wind is, and full the creek is running, and before a front the pressure of the air is falling, a sound those fissures do produce. Continuous, soft the sound is, and in a range pitched that the human ear, particularly the ear of a child, whose hearing further into the upper frequencies than an adult's extends, as voices in the middle distance interprets. In certain weather, singing it resembles. In other weather, conversation it resembles. In still other weather, the thin crying of infants it resembles. With the microphones he had brought the geologist the sound recorded, and for Vance in a motel room in Morganton, that evening played it back. And then, in his notes Vance wrote that, when his eyes he closed, and to the recording listened, his own name the sound contained, he could almost believe. As Dr. Cole said, a natural phenomenon it is. In several locations in the southern Appalachians it occurs. By itself dangerous it is not. But something else Vance also discovered. In the records of the settlement preserved in the county courthouse at Morganton, he found that previous disappearances there had been, not on the scale of 1851, but disappearances all the same. In the hollow in 1814 a hunter named Lemuel Gaither had vanished. 2 children, siblings named Isham and Dorcas Coggan, from a farm at the mouth of the hollow in 1833 had gone missing, and a week later silent and uncommunicative had been found, and within a year both had died. A traveling peddler named Ezra Mace, in 1844 had disappeared, and at the beech tree with the cross his abandoned cart had been found. The horses still in their traces, the peddler's ledger book on the driver's seat open to an entry for the 15th of September, 1844. That was never completed. A mill hand named Caradoc Swain in 1829 had vanished, the year the Cross Veitch put up. A pair of brothers, the Orchards. Up the Hollow hunting turkey in 1801 had gone, and only one had returned. And 3 weeks later the one who returned had hanged himself. A list of 17 separate incidents in the Hollow between 1789 and 1850 Vance compiled. Not random the pattern was, he noted. In the late autumn the incidents clustered. In years following wet summers they clustered. And in years in which the population of the settlement had increased they clustered. Most disturbingly, as though to pressure or to opportunity the Hollow were responding. In the Cherokee ethnographic records held at the Smithsonian, Vance also found a reference to the place, which not as the place where the ground remembers translates, but more precisely as the place that keeps what it takes. A Cherokee prohibition he found, by an ethnographer named James Mooney in 1889 recorded, against under any circumstances bringing children to the clearing, and specifically against in numbers greater than one bringing them. The specificity of the prohibition the ethnographer had not understood, and as a local superstition had dismissed it. With a diary in front of him, Vance the specificity understood exactly. At a time 1 child, the tradition said. More never. 2 on the 6th of October Miss Truitt had brought. 4 on the 13th she had brought. 31 on the 21st she had brought. To believe Vance came, and this is where against publication his dissertation advisor, a professor named Lanford Tremaine, warned him that the cause of the disappearances the sound in the clearing was not the lure, it was something else in that place, something that in his notes he did not name, because for it he could not find a name. The sound used to draw prey in, and children the prey it preferred. The tradition implied and the pattern confirmed was circumstantial. The evidence for his interpretation was on the Cherokee prohibition. It was based on the pattern of disappearances, on the condition of the 4 returned children, and on the testimony of Absalom Ravenel's mother, that out of her son's eyes whatever looked was not her son. And on one further piece of evidence, which in the state sanitarium records he found when to examine them in 1974, he obtained permission. Everything that piece of evidence changed. That on the afternoon of the 3rd of February, 1928, at the precise minute that his last 3 words Absalom Ravenel spoke and died, in a ward on the other side of the building a patient, a woman named Orpha Quill, who for hysterical melancholia in 1917 had been committed, and who at the time of her death 63 years old was, also had died, he found. Natural causes her death certificate listed. The ward journal for her ward, however, recorded that in exactly the same manner as Absalom she had died, that for her entire decade at the sanitarium silent and unresponsive she had been, and that at 300 as in the afternoon on the 3rd of February, her eyes she had opened, and in a clear voice 3 words had said, the same 3 words, "They are coming," and her eyes had closed and died. Her history back Vance traced. In 1917, from a boarding house in Asheville, she had been committed, where under the name Orpha Quill for 24 years alone she had been living. In Asheville in 1893 she had appeared. Up the mountain road on foot, she had come, the boarding house keeper had said, alone, in the fragments of a child's pinafore dressed, though by then a woman of 48 she was. Her name she had not been able to give. One the boarding house keeper for her had chosen the name Orpha Quill was, in order to have something in the ledger to write. When she arrived, a single small object she had carried, which with her effects until her commitment the boarding housekeeper kept. A pressed flower it was, a greenish, white orchid veined with dark purple, that in candlelight looked black it was, a species that in North Carolina did not grow it was, and by any botanist had never been catalogued. The flower Dr. Emmerich Cole in the upper room of the Halsey store on the evening of the 15th of October 1851, Miss Truitt had shown it was. Further back the woman's history Vance traced. Through features on her death photograph he traced it. Through dental records the sanitarium had kept he traced it. Through the shape of a small birthmark on her left wrist, finally he traced it, which by the admitting doctor in 1917 had been noted, and which precisely a birthmark described in Evangeline hen music. Truitt's diary matched, in an entry from the spring of 1851, in which her youngest pupil Miss Truitt had described a girl named Comfort Pettigrew, who on the morning of the 21st of October 6 years old had been, and whose rag doll named Susanna, on the flat rock of music, beside the spring 4 days into the search had been found, where when further into the clearing than any of the others had walked she had left it. Comfort Pettigrew Orpha Quill had been. Into the hollow at the age of 6 in 1851 she had walked, and out of it at the age of 48 in 1893 she had walked 42 years later. A flower that in the world had not existed carrying, and then for another 35 years in silence she had lived, and at the precise moment that Absalom Ravenel had died she had died, and his same last words she had spoken. There Vance's manuscript ends. What to do with what he had found he did not know. In a private letter to his advisor he wrote, which Tremaine kept, and which in the garage box, that in 2019 was sold was, that through a window into something that should not be looked at he felt he was looking, and that on the nights after the sanitarium records he read to dream of a clearing, only once he had visited, he had begun. In 1978 he burned the manuscript. Music, the copy that survived, the one in the estate sale in 2019 bought, a carbon duplicate he had made in 1976 for his advisor and forgotten about is. The historian who bought it, a woman named Marta Wexler of the State Archives. It either has not published. No intention of ever doing so, she said when in the summer of 2024 I contacted Music her. That still there the clearing is she believes. As to believe Vance came. That still the spring runs she believes. That in the right weather still the fishers sing she believes. And in some sense that to articulate she does not wish the other 27 children, who into the hollow in 1851 walked, are still unaccounted for she believes, though exactly why she will not say. Once to the site she has been. Again she will not go. One final detail. And with it to the end of what can be known we come. In 2006, a hiker on the Appalachian Trail, which within about 3 miles of what once Ashcom Hollow was passes, to a park ranger reported that in a fog disoriented he had become an off-trail, had wandered and he music. Upon a small clearing with a spring in it, perhaps half an acre in size, had come. What he took to be children singing he had heard, he said, though no children he could see. And on a flat rock beside the spring, for what about 15 minutes he believed, was he had sat listening, to locate the source trying. When at last he had risen, and back to the trail found his way. On their way north 2 groups of other hikers had passed him, and each of them, when he had asked, a different date him had told. When at the end of that day the ranger station he reached, that 4 days had passed since off the trail he had stepped he learned. Of where during those days he had been he had no memory. In his pack a small pressed flower, greenish, white, and veined with a dark purple, that in certain light looked almost black he had, which picking he did not remember. The flower the ranger took, to a botanist for identification promised to send it, and the report filed. Never identified the flower was. In 2011 the ranger retired. In a filing cabinet in the ranger station the report is. At the temples in the following year the hiker's hair went white. In Ohio he lives. Phone calls he does not return. This mystery shows us that always buried the past does not stay, and that unvisited some places are best left, not because in any fashion the old stories would recognize they are haunted, but because indifferent to us in ways We cannot fully understand the ground itself, the geology and the weather, and the deep time of the mountains. Maybe, or because its own hunger, its own patience, and its own slow measure of years what the mountains hold, whatever it is, has. Out of that hollow in 1851 4 children walked. 27 did not. 42 years later one returned, changed beyond recognition. A flower that should not have existed carrying. And in a small private cemetery in western North Carolina, to this day a marker with no name on it there is, only a date, October 21st, 1851, and the single word, lost, which a descendant of the Ashcom family in 1951 exactly hear music 100 years after the walk to have erected paid for. Because what 3 times the county had tried to forget someone she felt ought to remember. The stonemason she told, who his apprentice told, who a local reporter told, who in a notebook that was never published it wrote down, that by a feeling she could not name all her life she had been haunted. A feeling that strongest in the late autumn to her came. A feeling as though, just below the threshold of hearing, somewhere a group of voices were singing, and by name were calling her, and closer, were asking her to come. Only the children, they said. Only the children. But since the day the story, she had learned a child again she had never been. And so from whatever it was safe she was, she said, and that by raising the stone, somehow the debt that her family and her county and her country to those 27 who had gone and never come back owed she might discharge, she hoped. What of this story do you think? That the graduate student Hollister Vance, about what in that clearing lived, was right, do you believe? Or that a simpler, sadder explanation the whole affair has, do you believe? A teacher who well meant, a geological curiosity, a community that the weight of what to prevent it had failed could not bear, and a woman who half a lifetime later out of the mountains wandered with in her hand a flower, and in her throat a silence that no doctor could open. Your comment below leave and us tell what in Ashcom Hollow you think truly happened. If this tale you enjoyed and more forgotten American histories like this one want, subscribe music, the notification bell hit, and with someone who loves dark mysteries share this. In the next video see you.